Well, today I'm going to talk about prompting. Prompting is, let me have this screen here. Yeah, prompting is a relatively recent area of research in natural language processing. Maybe 2 at most 3 years old. And in fact, I'm a newbie as well in this field, so don't expect such a detailed presentation here. In fact, I was interested in this topic and I thought maybe it's going to be of more interest in the coming future. So for those of you who are looking for specific research topics to be working on in natural language processing, or for those of you who've heard about prompting but probably do not have much details about it, I just had a couple of papers read and I'm just giving a high-level introduction here. And obviously, I'm not going into the details of specific papers. So this is a high-level introductory talk. Okay, let me start with this. So from my point of view, some 10 years ago, 15 years ago, natural language processing was something like this. So we had so many different silos for different areas in NLP, which had significant differences from one to another. For instance, we had a field such as machine translation, in which we had so many specific details. We had language model, we had translation model, we had a phrase-based decoding model, etc., etc. So many details in them. And for you to get started with the field, you had to read so many papers from so many years back and so many implementation details. There were so many other fields, like we had word sense disambiguation, let's say, in which we had supervised models that used to work based on several features extracted from the sentence. Or we had other models like sequence tagging, things like named entity recognition or POS tagging. We had so many sophisticated models like conditional random fields, so many different features. And my main point here is that different areas in NLP, like I guess many other areas in artificial intelligence, were significantly independent from one another. There were small overlaps among different models, but each and every different topic had its own state-of-the-art model with so many complications, so many years of research behind it, and there wasn't much overlap between them. Something like 7-8 years ago, with the introduction of word embeddings and with the extensive use of neural networks, things changed a bit. So we had a small revolution in natural language processing. Now, say in 2015, many of the models used to have word embeddings as their way of representing a context or a sequence. And many of them used to have sequence encoders like LSTMs or bi-LSTMs as a part of their model. But still, we had significant differences among different models still. And in 2017, late 2017, early 18, there was a huge tsunami in natural language processing. A paper with the title "Attention is All You Need," and a simple architecture called transformers massively modified the field. I'm going to explain a bit how. And to my point of view, NLP now is something like this. We have some sort of a unified model, like a single mount, which is pre-trained on a specific task, usually with language modeling objectives. And for different downstream tasks, you take the same model, like same pre-trained model here, slightly adapted, like you slightly adapt it for a bit for a target task, like POS tagging, like machine translation, like word sense disambiguation. And you can already use that model for that downstream task, for the target task, without changing the main part of the model. And surprisingly, this unified model usually performs much better than all the complicated models we had before transformers. And I guess most of you know about transformers. In fact, they are very simple architectures, feed-forward. In fact, we have to do something like positional encoding in order to sort of force the order of the sentence to the model, because everything is feed-forward. All the sentence is input at once to the model, unlike what we had for recurrent neural networks. And well, there are different bits, but there is nothing novel real here. The main gist here is something called self-attention. And just to, well, this is not a talk about transformers, not a talk about self-attention, but just to provide a high-level concept of what self-attention does. In fact, self-attention is a relatively new spin in the attention mechanism, in which an input text attends to itself. So let me give an example here. For instance, the word cell in this sentence is an ambiguous term. It can refer to the cell phone, to the prison cell, and to the living cell, among others. And for a human to be able to understand the intended meaning of this word in the sentence, we have to read the context. Probably we have to look at the membrane, which is probably the trigger word here, to understand, yeah, this is talking about the living cell. This is exactly what self-attention is trying to do. Self-attention tries to mimic the same process while processing each and every word. It looks at the context at itself, at the same sentence, in order to better contextualize the representation of that word given the context. And as I said, well, maybe for a PhD student who started in NLP in 2010 and 2015 and 2020, NLP looks like completely different fields, because people talk about completely different stuff and models are completely different. Okay, one of the famous transformer-based models is called BERT. You've probably all heard about it. And essentially, it's a modification of the original transformers model. Well, the sequence-to-sequence objective is changed to a classification objective. I'll mention that briefly in the next slide. And we have a stack of encoders. There are no decoders here. The model is pre-trained on something called masked language modeling. Let me describe it here. It's in fact a version of language modeling objective in which you provide the model with lots of text, like gigabytes of textual data, even terabytes. And the only thing you do is to mask some of the words in the input text. And the only thing you expect the model to do is to predict the word which is masked. What was the word that I'm covering here? What about this one? How about this one? This is the only objective the model is trained, based on which the model is trained. And it's really interesting, with a simple objective as this, the model can encode lots of different knowledge about linguistic properties. So the objective is a simple MLM, but as a byproduct of that, for a model to be able to do a good MLM objective, it apparently looks like that it has to learn a lot of different linguistic phenomena, for example, syntax. So, well, just to briefly explain here, we have something called syntactic parse trees, which are ordered rooted trees that represent the syntactic structure of a sentence. So, for example, this is the syntactic parse tree of a given sentence. And surprisingly, it's a famous paper from Hewitt and Manning from 2019. They found that the model to some extent encodes this grammatical structure of a sentence in its own representations. So again, remember, we do not have anything about syntax, nothing about the structure of a sentence in the training objective. The only thing we do is to cover some words and ask the model to remind that, or to predict that. And it's really interesting that for the model to be able to predict that masked word, it has to learn the structure of the sentence. That's one aspect of this encoded knowledge. Talking about semantics, the blue points we have here are in fact the contextualized representations of an ambiguous word, paper, as it appears in different sentences, denoting different meanings. So, and if we look at the contextualized embeddings in the space, in the dimensionality reduced space, we can see there are different clusters. For example, this cluster here is the set of those sentences that talk about paper as a material, like printed on watermark paper. Without pen and paper is the material paper, whereas on the left side we have the paper, the scientific paper, like, I don't know, the paper challenged astronomers. Somewhere here at the bottom we have a cluster talking about newspaper, the other meaning of paper, like a free paper published fortnightly or something like that. And there are some points at the middle that are somehow at the border between different meanings. It's not clear, even for the model, even for us when we look at sentences, that if it is talking about the material, if it is talking about the research paper or the newspaper. So again, the model can encode semantics as a byproduct of language model, another interesting phenomenon. Another example from a different paper, the word die or die, depending on the language, in different sentences. So for example, we have a cluster here talking about the German definite article die, and another cluster here at the bottom, a cluster for the verb die in English. And it's really interesting that there are two subclusters depending on if a single person dies or if multiple people die. And we have another cluster for the plain die. So there is a distinct representation for the different meanings of a word in the encoded latent space of BERT or any other transformer-based model or contextualized model. Well, there are so many papers here. I can talk for 5 hours maybe talking about the different studies on the encoded knowledge, but just this last one, this is a paper that was accepted to EMNLP last week to graduate students of mine. It's a really interesting study on how BERT encodes different knowledge in specific tokens. So for example, what we found that was that in the S token, which can be either a token to make a noun plural or a verb, a third person, single person present, third person, single present, whatever. And interestingly, we found that BERT encodes the difference between the two usages of the S token in the representation space. So for example, here we have a verb that does not have the S token, like does, and it appears in the same cluster as a verb like pretends or awaits. Well, there are so many details here. I do not really want to go in details of this. And another illustration that shows that information about the length of the sentence or the positional information of words in the sentence are usually encoded in the punctuation words. Another interesting finding of this paper. Well, there are so many details, so many experiments here, which I'm not really interested in going into the details of. Okay, all the observations I mentioned here on the different types of encoded knowledge in pre-trained models are based on a set of experiments called probing. In fact, a probe is a shallow classifier, a very simple classifier, maybe one or at most 2 layers of a neural network that is applied to the output representation of a model. So this is a model like BERT. We have an input to that model. We take the output representations of the model. So the model is not touched. We do not update the parameters of the model. And we have a shallow classifier, the green part on top, and we expect if the classifier performs well on a specific task, let's say for POS tagging, we assume that the POS information is encoded well in the representations that are output from BERT. Well, again, probing is another really popular topic these days. So many different papers. I can talk for several hours. One of the challenging debates recently about probing is that it's not really clear if this performance in a specific probing task is really coming from the representations or from the screen classifier. It's not clear. Maybe it's the classifier which is learning that a specific task, because usually the training data for these probing tasks are large. We have thousands of examples to train a classifier. This is one of the challenging questions recently being asked about probing, and one of the reasons you might want to have probing results under question. And in fact, this is the first reason today why we might be interested to go for prompting. So please keep this in mind. The first reason to go for prompting might be that probing techniques based on supervised classification are a bit prone to this type of issues. Like, it's not clear if the results from a probing experiment can be associated to the probing itself, to the classifier, the capacity we have a set of parameters here, right? It's not clear if they are encoded here or in the output representations. That's the first reason. But we have two more important reasons to go for prompting. Well, before even saying what prompting is. Okay. Okay, so we have a pre-trained model like BERT, which is pre-trained on a task like mask language modeling. And usually the conventional way, the standard way of using this pre-trained model in a target downstream task is to do something called fine-tuning. So for example, you can take the pre-trained BERT model for a sentence pair classification task by doing something like this. We provide the model with two sentences at the input with a special token in between, the SEP token. And there is another special token here called CLS. We just take the CLS token from the last layer and do a classification here. Like, we have a softmax here and do a classification. And for example, based on the cross entropy of this classification, we update the parameters of this model for a bit. Let's say the original BERT model is trained for 1 million steps, like it's trained for a month, for a few weeks. But for fine tuning, you do it for just a couple of thousands of steps, like for an hour, for half an hour. So it's as the name suggests, it's a small tuning of the model, not a real training of it. And there are other, well, we have so many different models, right? Oof. Let me clear this up. Okay, like if you have a single sentence, another task like sentiment analysis, in which you have an input sentence and you have to classify it as being positive or negative. You just input one sentence to the model and do a classification on CLS. If you have other tasks like question answering, you provide the question and the paragraph, and the model just tells you the span in which the answer is expected to be, etc. Same for single sentence. So this is the standard way of using pre-trained models like BERT in downstream tasks. But fine-tuning might not always be the answer. Why? In fact, there are two reasons here mentioned, and the two reasons are the reasons we might be interested in doing prompting. These are the problems with fine-tuning. We're looking for an alternative to fine-tuning, which is called prompting. The first reason is that for fine-tuning, you usually need a lot of data. It's a supervised classification task usually, for which you need lots and lots of annotated data. But we know there are so many different languages, so many different text domains, so many different tasks, and it's impossible to have annotated data for each and every one of this. It's costly to annotate data by humans. So, and it's a real world situation. So you happen to encounter so many different tasks in natural language processing for which you do not have data, or for which you can generate just a couple, like 10, 20, 50 at most, labeled data. And therefore, and fine-tuning does not work with as little data as this. That's the first reason fine-tuning might not be an option in many different settings, because it fails on a small data set, and a small data set is a real-world situation in different scenarios. The other reason is that recently models are getting larger and larger and larger. So for instance, I'll talk later a bit about the GPT-3 model. It's a really huge model with 170 billion, 175 billion parameters. And well, no one have tried it probably in academia, but you need something like 200 or 300 gigabytes of GPU RAM just to load the model. Don't think about training the model again. And obviously, once you cannot load the model to your RAM, how can you fine-tune that? The only way you can use the model is to prompt it. So I'm already giving you some hint. To just check for some information in the model itself without doing any update of the parameters. So these are in fact reasons 2 and 3. If you remember, I talked about probing and why there is so much debate behind it, why it's not the optimal way of checking for the encoded knowledge in different models. That was one reason. These are reasons 2 and 3 why we are going for prompting. Okay. But what is prompting? Prompting is a reformulation of a target task for it to look like a language modeling task. For instance, well, this is the original pre-training, the MLM pre-training I talked about several times. So you mask some words and you train the model just to predict them. Like we expect the model to predict this word here, etc. And the usual fine-tuning is that we show a lot of labeled examples to the model and do some classification supervision on the parameters of the data. Prompting, in fact, a prompt is a piece of text. It's like a sentence that you attach to the input, this part. So the input here is no reason to watch. It's a sentiment analysis task. You have to classify if it is talking positively or negatively about that movie, for example. What you do in prompting is to attach a piece of text, a sentence, or a template to the input text, and the template has a masked word in it. And based on the prediction in that masked position, you do a classification. Like if the model predicts something like great here, you say it's a positive sentence. If the model says no, terrible is a more likely word to appear in the mask token, then it's a negative sentence. And we call these things label words. I'll talk a bit later about the different peculiarities here or different details. So prompting is something as simple as this. You want to reformulate a task like a classification as a masked language modeling. Why? Because pre-training was done using masked language modeling, and the only way you can use the pre-trained model without modifying it for a target task is to modify the target task to the objectives of the training. That's masked language modeling. And how can we do that? For a task like sentiment analysis, we can generate a template that has a mask token, a blank space. And depending on how the model fills the blank space, we classify the text, the input, which is obviously the first part here, as positive or negative. In fact, the first time prompting was introduced was from the GPT papers, like the generative models that are introduced by OpenAI. In fact, the GPT-1 as early as 2018, but Recently, there has been much more interest, like I think 2020, 2021, there are so many more papers about prompting because now it's getting a more and more serious problem. In fact, just before this session, I was checking for biddings for the AAAI conference, and there were so many papers with the word prompt in their title. Okay, the thing they did was like for a task like summarization, you have a long text like this blue part is a big document and you want to summarize it. The only thing they do is to add a prompt like TLDR, like too long don't read, and let the model generate the rest. The green part is generated by the model, and this is taken as the summarization of the blue part. Or for a task like translation, you provide the model with some examples. This is the example you provide for the model. This is the English sentence. This is the French translation. Now I have my input. Please generate for me the translation for this English sentence in French. And they did the same thing for text classification and reading comprehension and other tasks. So the idea goes back to late 2018, I guess, for GPT-1. But as I said, it's much more popular nowadays because it's not only used for these generative models, but for a lot of other models, including BERT. Okay, based on different viewpoints, I'm going to classify the different prompting paradigms into 4 different classes. Depending on the template, we can classify paradigms into discrete and soft. Well, I'll give you the details what a discrete prompt looks like and how is it different to have a soft prompt. So this is based on the template. We can classify the existing paradigms into, or the existing techniques into discrete and soft. Also, depending on the functionality of the model, if you touch the parameters of the pre-trained model or if you leave them fixed, you do not touch them. We also have prompt-based fine-tuning and prompt-based, prompting without fine-tuning or prompting with fixed parameters. So this is the classification I have in mind, and in the rest of this talk, I'm going to give you a high-level introduction, like a basic motivation why each of these exists and how they are different to one another, and what are the advantages or disadvantages of each, or the limitations. Okay, starting from discrete fine-tuned. One of the pioneering models is PET. It's a paper from 2021. In fact, well, I think the archive version is earlier than this. A very recent paper in any case, and this is a discrete model with fine-tuning. Well, when we say discrete, it means that we have words in the prompt. Like the template, the prompt are discrete words in the vocabulary space. It's not continuous representations in that space. So what the model does is to, well, in fact, the authors designed a set of templates, a set of prompts. Like again, for the sentiment analysis task, they designed templates like this. Well, that's the templates like it was blank space. And what they did was to fine-tune, let me explain here in parentheses that when we talk about fine-tuning, we are still using labeled data from the task, but usually much less data than the usual fine-tuning of pre-trained models. So we do a fine-tuning of this new prompt-based model, and we expect the model to generate label words like this, great and bad. In fact, we expect the model to generate the word great here if the label is positive, and bad if the label is negative. In fact, we force the model to generate these 2 tokens based on the label of the sentence in the training data. and a simple cross-entropy, a simple mask language modeling. The model is fine-tuned on a small amount of labeled data from the target task. Well, in fact, what they do is to design different templates for each task. Like here we have 3 different templates, also different target label words, and they combine them somehow. I'm not again going into details of that, even in the interest of time. And just to give you an example for the templates they use, for example, for the sentiment analysis task, well, this is a 5-class task, 5-class classification from 1 to 5. They used 5 different templates, like they attach this template to the input sentence. It was, well, apparently there is this one as well. Yeah. No. This is the, I guess A is the input sentence. Yeah. Or this one is attached, or any of the other 4 templates. And the model is expected to generate the word terrible for label 1, the word okay for the neutral case, which is 3, etc., etc. This is for sentiment analysis, for a 5-class sentiment analysis data set, Yelp. And this is for another task like on the MNLI dataset, natural language inference. So here you have 2 sentences, sentence A and sentence B. And the task is if sentence B entails sentence A, or it contradicts, or they are neutral. Like, well, I don't think there is enough time for me to provide you with examples, but the task is as simple as this. You have 2 sentences, and you have to say if the second sentence contradicts the first one or entails it, like the same information is mentioned across both the sentences. Well, there are 2 templates for this task, and these are 2 sets of label words. Like if it is contradiction, the model has to give you wrong for the first template, for either of the templates. Maybe is for the case of neutral, and right is for the case of entails. Or as simple as no, yes, and maybe again. Right? So you reformulate natural language inference as a mask language modeling task. And you expect the model to give you a yes here if this is an entail instance in your dataset. Well, in fact, there are so many advantages to using prompt instead of the usual fine-tuning. First is that in fine-tuning, you have to, for each and every downstream task, maybe for each and every downstream data set in a downstream task, you have to fine-tune a specific model. You have to keep different copies for task A, task B, task C. And well, these are huge models. They take a lot of space. Tuning them is not easy. And then at the inference time, you have to take the specific model for your task. All the instances in your batch, which is provided at the inference time to the model, need to be from the same task. You have limitations like this in the normal fine-tuning of the model. But for a prompt tuning, first of all, you do not need to have many different copies of the model. You can just have one model, because you're not, you have a slight changes to the model, so you can combine all the different tasks into a single model. So, and you do not need to have additional parameters. Like you just need to keep the prompts, and the other advantage is that you do not need to have the same task in the same batch of input instances. Like you can have an instance from task A, another from task B, another from task C, and have them all input to the model as a single batch, and ask the model to classify them or whatever other task we have. So there are so many advantages to use prompt based fine-tuning than the usual fine-tuning, in addition to the things I described earlier. Okay, and these are the results from the PET paper. Well, depending on the size of the data, like they provide just 10 examples per class, I guess, for training this model. If it is a supervised model, as I said, fine-tuning fails on a small amount of data. Well, the accuracy is just 20% on a task like Yelp, which is close to random guess. It's a 5-class classification task, and other data sets. So for a small amount of data, a prompt-based model does much, much better than the conventional fine-tuning. But as the data gets larger, like as we approach 100 and 1,000, the gap almost disappears. So prompt, well, at least PET is suitable for smaller amounts of training data, for few-shot learning, if you want. That's one observation. Well, they have another version of PET called iPET, which is an iterative PET in which they are trying to combine different templates based on the confidence of the model. They progressively increase the size of the data set. Well, that's another push to the model to make it better than the original one. But essentially, the idea is the same. And that's the main observation here. Again, looking at this graph, for a smaller amounts of data, there is a huge gap between the conventional fine-tuning technique and the prompt-based technique. So a difference from 20% to almost 60%. But as the data set gets larger, the gap almost disappears. Okay. Something to note here is that designing templates is not trivial. In fact, you need to do a lot of trial and error. You have to provide the model with a lot of different templates, check if they work or not, and it's not clear. There is no, you need to have some information about the model, but it's not clear. There is no guideline on how to generate templates for a specific task or a specific model. Even there is a chance that if you design some templates for like BERT, and if you take it to Roberta, the template is not going to work anymore. So it's really sensitive to design templates. In fact, we have an example here. On a task like sentiment analysis, again, on the Stanford sentiment dataset. These are 5 different templates that were tried with 16 examples, I guess. So it's a few-shot learning scenario. And well, this is the positive label used, and this is the negative one. Well, the best is if you have a template like it was masked, and you take great as the positive label and terrible as the negative one. But you see, as soon as we change the label words, the template is the same, but we change the label words to good and bad, slightly the performance drops. If we use unrelated words like cat and dog, again, the performance drops. So if you have more relevant words in your label words, well, there is a higher chance for you to get a better performance. Interestingly, if you swap the 2 words, if you use dog as your positive word and cat as your negative, the performance drops something like 5%. So this model, which is I think Roberta, has a more positive interpretation of dog than cat apparently. And obviously, if you swap terrible and great, there is a huge drop from that first case to the last one, something around 10%. And well, even a small punctuation might make a difference. Label words might make a lot of difference. So it's a bottleneck in prompt-based techniques in order for you to manually design the template. So one of the research directions here is to try to generate templates automatically. In fact, that's the research question this paper from 2020, AutoPrompt, tries to do. So we leave the task of coming up with a prompt to the model itself. How? We define a set of trigger words, trigger tokens, if you want, in addition to the mask token we already have. And what AutoPrompt does is to do a gradient-based search over the space of tokens in order to find the best tokens. Like here we have a template of 5 tokens and a mask word. And depending on the output, we just leave the model, well, we do not force the model to follow our template. We just give it to the model to come up with a template that suits it best. And well, we initialize all these words to the mask token, and we just leave the model to learn them. Well, this is a template obtained for this sentiment analysis task again. Well, don't expect to read it. It makes no sense. It's a set of random words. But usually the templates you get from automatically, automatic search for prompts are something meaningless like this. But the fact is that you get a huge jump. Let me first show you this and then I'll go back to the examples. From the manual designing of the prompt to the automatically obtaining them, you get a huge jump from something like 20% on the SSD dataset. On BERT, maybe a bit less for Roberta. When you provide this flexibility to the model to search for the prompt by itself. Well, there's a simple gradient-based search here in this paper. But as I said, this is an open research question. You can come up with other ways of defining your template or searching for the tokens in your template. Going back here again for 4 different tasks, these are the templates, the pink parts that are that are found by the model. Like for the NLI task, this is the template. For something called factor retrieval. Factor retrieval is something like so for example, here you have Obama was born in, you have a triplet like Obama was born in Hawaii, let's say. You have a triplet like this. You provide the subject and the relation which is born in, and you expect the object from the model. So, so here is the subject. These are the tokens that represent your relation. Well, again, meaningless, a set of tokens that model thinks are representative of a specific relationship. And we expect the model to provide us with the object here, which is the other end of this relation in the mask token. And again, for the label tokens, we have a set of words that are not necessarily meaningful. But we have a huge jump from manual designing of prompts to automatic designing of prompts. However, still there is a big gap from the conventional fine-tuning to even automatic prompting. Again, we have a gap of 5% on sentiment. We have a gap of, again, 5% for what the task is, SIG-E dataset, which is another classification dataset. So another research direction is to fill this gap, to come up with better prompting techniques in order to fill the gap to the conventional fine-tuning. And that's where soft prompts come in. In fact, AutoPrompt has gone halfway through what we want for soft prompting. So the basic idea here is that, well, you leave the task of finding the prompt to the model. Why do you have to limit the model to the vocabulary you have? The model is searching in a continuous space of representations. Why do you have to limit it to a set of discrete words that are there in that representation space? Just let the model learn a continuous prompt, which is best for the target task. So essentially, you have the same process. You have a set of trigger tokens to be learned. The only difference is that these trigger tokens there is no need for them to be in the vocabulary. They are some custom tokens that are defined by the model. So let's say token 1215, just a new token in the vocabulary. And they are specifically tuned by the model in order to find, in order to perform best in that target task, let's say it this way. And well, it's not surprising to see that soft prompts do much better than manual prompts. Well, this is prompt design, so if you come up with a discrete prompt, I guess this is something called like PET, not auto prompt. But still, you have a huge gap when you move from the discrete space of tokens to the continuous space of soft tokens by the model. And you provide this flexibility for your model to, to place a vector anywhere in the space which is most suitable for it. But another research problem, well, I'm mentioning different research problems during this presentation. Here is that even the soft prompts tend to be competitive with the conventional fine-tuning, which is the orange line. When the model gets large, like you need to have at least 10 billion parameters in your model for soft prompting to work. Whereas for smaller models, we have a large gap still between soft prompting and conventional fine-tuning. So we expect, well, ideally we want a green line which is either similar to the orange one or has a better slope here. But again, compared to fine-tuning, this is much better. For fine-tuning, you need to have so many parameters. This is the blue line. But for soft prompting, you need a few orders of magnitude less parameters for learning a prompt. And obviously, this is the manual prompt for which you do not have any parameters. You just provide the model with a set of templates. And it's on your shoulders to come up with a template, not the model. Okay, so the last type I'm going to talk about is discrete prompts with fixed parameters. As I said earlier, models like GPT-3 are so huge that you have no way of fine-tuning them. You have no way of touching the parameters. The only way you can use them is something called learning through context, or what GPT-3 calls meta-learning. And the idea is really simple, and it works. Well, in many different tasks, it works nicely. For instance, for a task such as machine translation, you provide the model with a set of demonstrations. Like you give a sentence, well, a phrase in English, and the corresponding translation for that. Another example here, a third one. Well, this is just a special token to just tell the model. It's like a separation token. And then you provide the input to the model and ask the model to generate an output for you. Well, you usually have a task description on top. It's like, well, these generative models are, they are generative, so it's like you can talk with them. They can generate text for you. They are not having the limitation of masked language modeling. So you can ask them to generate free text, like a description of something or any number of words you want here. This is about meta-learning or demonstrations. And another research question here is how to come up with demonstrations that are best. In fact, there are a number of papers that show that it's really important how to choose the demonstration examples. And in fact, there is a very recent paper that shows that if you select the examples that look more similar to your input, you are having more chances of getting better results in your task. Or even the order matters. So this is another open research question here, how to come up with more suitable demonstrations that lead to better performance. There are also other types of questions. So for example, the GPT-3, which is performing like surprisingly well in different tasks, just fails on some tasks like the word in context dataset, like if you search for Vic dataset. It's a simple disambiguation task that was designed by a colleague of mine and me a few years ago. And the GPT-3 model doesn't do anything better than the random baseline on a task like this. So there are other open possibilities here. There are so many different tasks that on which the model has not yet been tested. And even on the models tested, there are better ways of coming up with the demonstration examples to do better. Well, this GPT-3 model is really cool. I think probably many of you have already heard about it. For instance, you can provide the model with a description of, a code, like an application you want to develop, like a React code here, a JavaScript, and the model generates based on this description here, like you want 2 buttons, one add $3, another one withdraw $5, and then show you balance. And the model generates this piece of code for you. In fact, this is the exact code generated by the model. You have a like piece of HTML calling some function like withdraw 5, and you have the corresponding function for that. And there are so many nice, interesting demos on different tasks. If you're interested, just go on Twitter or I don't know, YouTube and search for GPT-3. And for example, this is one of the, sort of startups or applications that are powered by GPT-3, dbuild.co. Just go and check if you are interested. Okay, for the interest of time, just to explain briefly here that this is how demonstrations work. Probably for this code generation model, you provide some code descriptions and the specific code for that description. Another example here, the corresponding code, and then you give the description of the code you want to be generated and ask the model to generate the code. It's a generative model. It generates a piece of code for you. And the developer says, for simple programs, there is no need even for you to debug it. It's already runnable. Okay, so that's to wrap up, that's the 4 different types of prompting techniques I just quickly covered. We have discrete prompts, and in discrete prompts, we can come up with the prompt manually. We can design it. We can write it by ourselves by trial and error. But as I said, it can be very error prone. It can have many problems, like it's difficult to come up with a prompt for a new task. It's difficult to come up with the label words. So another possibility is to leave that to the model, to ask the model to generate prompts, the automatic branch. And again, you can let the model have the flexibility not to come up with a natural language prompt, but with a soft prompt. So discrete prompts are more interpretable. You can read the text, maybe get some meaning from it, why the model is generating this prompt. But for soft prompts, they are just custom tokens. They are totally meaningless. And depending on functionality, we have fine-tuning based prompting, in which you want to do better for few shot cases. In a scenario where you have just a few examples per class, like say 10 examples for a classification task, what's the solution? Obviously, it's better to go for prompt-based fine-tuning than the normal conventional fine-tuning. But it's not even possible to do a light fine-tuning like this for many of the larger models. That's where prompting with fixed parameters comes in. And I mentioned different open problems for all the 4 paradigms. And well, my speculation is that in a few years, this is going to be one of the hottest research topics in natural language processing. There are so many different open problems. Some of them I mentioned before, some of them I have in mind. If you are interested, we can talk offline about the different possibilities here.